Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Learning through play starts with Lego Duplo. With Lego Duplo, toddlers can develop real-life skills while having fun with colorful bricks made just for them. Large, easy to grip, and safe to explore. When children express themselves with Lego Duplo, they build patience, problem-solving, and empathy. See your child learn perseverance and self-expression with everything they imagine and create. Visit lego.com/preschool to learn more.
You're listening to the For the Good of the Public podcast, brought to you by the Center for Christianity and Public Life. We're your hosts. I'm Michael Ware.
And I'm Phoebe Meyer.
Phoebe, this is, they're all precious to me. But I really loved this panel conversation on creating a culture of care. It was so many things. All of the panelists were fantastic. Liz Tenety, who's a journalist I've known, respected, learned from for years, does a brilliant job moderating this conversation. And I just love it's in some ways a microcosm of CCPL. So much is happening. There's policy, there's family and culture. There's, I think, a real nimbleness with how the conversation is able to go back and forth between the structural and the personal.
Yeah.
There's really differing and even sort of conflicting perspectives, but the conversation is all oriented towards the public good. So you get difference without antagonism. And I just can't wait for folks to hear this great conversation among really remarkable people.
Yeah, one of the things that's really fun is that it is such a human conversation. And so the panelists are sharing some personal stories from their own journeys with parenthood. And you're going to get to hear some anecdotes of adventures with kids. And then this is also a talk that has an audience Q&A at the end. So it's one of our longer conversations, but I really encourage listeners to listen all the way through. It's actually in the audience Q&A that they get into some of the more meat around the policy issues. So at the beginning, they're talking a lot about what does it actually look like to have a culture of care? What does that mean? What is the kind of character that is necessary? And then at the end, they get more into the practical solutions. What does this look like on a policy level?
Yeah. And not only is this a longer episode, but I fear that we'll have listeners that really follow some of the breadcrumbs we've left here to more deeply discover the work of our panelists. So Elissa Strauss is just a fantastic book, When You Care, that I just gained a lot out of. Joe Waters with Capita is just, they're doing excellent, beautiful, deeply human policy work at Capita. Tim Carney, who's at AEI and just has written some remarkable books on family, on alienation in America. And then Dr. Charles Daniels, the head of Fathers Uplift, is a great nonprofit that I'm a big fan of. And so you have just these remarkable people who did not know each other prior to being on a panel together. Some of them have gone on to partner quite significantly since meeting on our panel, which we love to see. But so this conversation is meaty. You'll get an introduction to a whole set of issues related to care in America, parenting, elder care, fatherhood, a whole range of issues. But you will also find some trails to dig in even deeper if you want to walk down those roads.
The conversation you're about to hear is creating a culture of care. Our moderator is Liz Tenety, co-founder of Motherly and Founding Women. Our panelists are Tim Carney, Dr. Charles Daniels, Elissa Strauss, and Joe Waters. This talk was originally recorded at the 2024 For the Good of the Public Summit in Washington, D.C. A video recording of the talk and all the resources, including ways to follow the speakers in today's episode, will be found in the show notes.
Thank you all. Thanks for having us and being here on this very important panel about care. I am Liz Tenety. Thank you for the introduction. And I am going to once again mention that I'm also a mom of 5, and thanks to our nanny and our bonus second nanny filling in so I can be here in Washington, D.C. while my kids are back in Charlotte. I have asked our panelists today to introduce themselves, but then to also share their roles as caregivers in their families and in their communities. So thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. My name is Elissa Strauss. I'm a journalist, cultural critic, and author of a recently published book called When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others. And the book is a deep, soulful dive into why we don't value parenting and caregiving in our individual lives and our collective lives, and what it would look like if we did. And I am the mom to 2 kids that are currently in Oakland, California. And my husband has covered all the care stuff quite a bit these past 6 months since my books came out.
Good afternoon. I'm Joe Waters. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Capita, which is a think tank and a community imagining a future centered on families and their communities. I live with my family in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Let me just say I'm thankful for everyone who's expressed concern. My family is safe. We have power. We have water. But so many around us have experienced great devastation. And it has been really a testament to how communities care for one another. We've been deeply moved over the last week and a half since the hurricane. I care for a almost 4-year-old. He's very important that I say that. He turns 4 this month. Almost 4-year-old Albert and an 8-month-old Francis.
My name is Tim Carney. I'm a writer. Like Elissa, I had a book come out this spring. Mine was called Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Children Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. I'm also a journalist at the Washington Examiner, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a father of 6. So my wife is currently doing all the school pickup and all of that stuff today here in Northern Virginia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Charles Daniels. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Fathers Uplift Incorporated, the country's first outpatient mental health and substance use treatment facility for fathers and their families. And I am the proud husband of Samantha, the co-founder, as well as the proud father of Clayton and Samaya. And my job is to be their dad and let Samaya boss me around and paint my nails. And Clayton, let him play sports and, buy him games, and just a proud father and glad to be in their lives. So glad to be here as well.
Thank you all so much. So part of why I'm excited to do this panel at this context is to really ground us in the deeper questions around caregiving. Caregiving is a hot topic. It's on the campaign trail right now. It's in the headlines, but there is such depth to what we mean around caregiving. So what do you see as the deeper meaning of caregiving? And to all of our panelists, I'd love that answer. And how has your own experience as a parent and a caregiver more broadly shaped what the meaning of caregiving is to you? That's a big question for someone who just published 300 pages of an answer, basically, honestly. I was like, which answer do I give? I think for me, as someone who wrote a lot about motherhood and feminism for many years and chronicled the very real ways that becoming a mother can hold women back in their lives, I had 2 grandmas that cared dearly. Well, honestly, one more than the other. May their memories be a blessing, as we say in my tradition. But 2 grandmas that really gave their life to care and died in poverty, kind of as a result. So that really stuck with me, and I was eyes wide open to all the ways in which care can kind of hold us back as women. and had a really profound, deep experience when I became a mom. And I think it really turned on when my kids started talking, of finding caring for my kids some of the most philosophically, spiritually, intellectually, psychologically challenging work I'd ever experienced. And it wasn't the fairy tale version of care. It wasn't the Hallmark card version of Mother's Day, and it wasn't the nightmare that I think is a lot of the feminist discourse, frankly, today, the nightmare burden version of care. It was this rich, transcendent, messy middle. So for me, once I realized that, and I realized care was equal to many of these rich epiphany-seeking experiences I had, whether they were religious experiences, whether I was hiking a tall mountain or experimenting with psychedelics, which did not agree with me. All these things I did to try to find deeper truth and connection and meaning, I felt like I found through care. So that's where I'm at with it right now. And when I'm with my kids, I see care as much bigger than I think a lot of other people see care today. And that's the message I'm trying to share with the world.
Well, yes. So as I was reflecting on this question in preparation for this panel, two things immediately came to mind. First of all, the phrase deeply rooted in the biblical tradition of steadfast love. Care is steadfast love. I think it is a way in which we participate in the life of God and the creative power of God as creatures caring for other creatures, mirroring the steadfast love that God has for us, has for the planet. And so to me, that's the second dimension. That language, for example, around the care economy completely misses, is our responsibility towards creation, our duty towards creation to be caregivers and caretakers. And in that way, it becomes a key dimension of our stewardship.
So I'm a Catholic, and I went to Mass today. The Pope had said today's a day of prayer and fasting as the anniversary of the attacks in Israel a year ago. So I went to Mass today, and first on this theme, I was thinking, because the gospel reading, when Christ is asked what's a great commandment, and he answers correctly, or that he asks somebody else and they answer correctly, and it's love your neighbor as yourself, right? After loving God with all your heart. But then the little, I forget the name of it, the little verse we say before, I guess that was before the gospel reading, then was, I give you a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. And that's always a little bit of a heavy burden. I don't know anybody who's actually loved anybody else as Christ loved us. But then I always think parenting is like the cheat code for getting as close to that as possible. Any Gen Xers out there, remember, what was it? Left, right, up, down, A, B, A, B. It was a Nintendo Konami code to get 30 extra lives. So that's the way I think of parenting, is that it gets us closer to what God wants us to be. And the Bible says, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. I wake up every day and there are hungry, naked people in my house. They're right there. It's not made easy, but made simple.
Thank you.
Wow, that was great. That was great. When I think about care, there's a term that I hate. I know I'm not supposed to use that language here, but I hate the term self-made. To me, that term doesn't exist. I believe that we are all village-made, right? To suggest that you're self-made, to say, hey, when you first took your first steps and you fell, you picked yourself up by yourself, right? Oh, if you're self-made when you were younger, you changed your own diaper, right? Your parents have changed your diaper. It does not exist. See, I grew up in a household headed by two women, primarily my mother and my aunt. And in the absence of my father, my mother would keep me in a church where the deacons and the deaconesses and the pastors and the youth ministers would put their hands on me, pray for me, teach me how to tie a tie, tell me that they love me, right? Teach me how to line up my belt buckle correctly with my shirt buttons, right? The things that my father could not do for me. So for me, I believe that care consists of various people's aunties, uncles, teachers, coaches that contribute to the being of one person, right? And I believe that it's mutually beneficial. I think members of that culture have someone contribute to their being. none of us arrive to this place of love and care about ourselves. It takes a village. And I think in business, we have to completely erase this notion that you're self-made. Business and anywhere, no one is self-made. We're all village-made. And that's how I look at care from a village perspective.
Well, thank you, because that was a phenomenal setup for my next question, which is, you've painted a picture of care as the holiest work that we could do in Elissa's book, all around how care is the vehicle for personal growth in so many ways. But we live in a country that makes a lot of that hard, and a culture that has a lot of other ideas about care. What does America believe about caregiving? And I'm talking both about caring for children, caring for others, and caring for those in our village.
Well, I can give a stab at this. I mean, we could see care in what's happening with our elections. This whole concept of care. I believe that some Americans, and I can't say all Americans, I think care is this more selfish way of being. How do I get to this next point unscathed? How do I beat the other person? How do I make sure that I am the most successful and make sure that I look the best, right? I think to the extent that when we think about Galatians, right, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, kindness, right? In the midst of all of this, trying to be the best, we forget how to be kind, loving, and care for others. So we see there's this complete culture of trying to be the best. And in the process, we ignore other members and other principles of what it takes to actually be caring, right? I tell my students all the time, I say, you know what, my main goal here is not to teach you cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't want you to be a butthole. Whatever that looks like, right? We have to get back to the basics of being kind people. And I think currently it's hard to be kind in an overwhelming world that's all about self.
And to pick up what you just said, I think part of what's going on now, like we talk, care means a lot of things. And I've been answering all the definitions, basically come right through them when I've been discussing my book. But right, we kind of have the care we give to the external world. And then we have the really intimate care that takes place when one human truly depends on another to thrive and survive. And they're different, right? But they have connective tissue. And I think something that's happening now, and it's for cultural reasons, and it's for structural reasons, and it's for economic and policy reasons, many, many reasons, I don't think we can point to one, is I don't think many people don't feel able or willing to incubate that caring self within those care relationships, whether it's parent and child, grandparent, child, aunties and cousins. And I think if we can't incubate that caring self in a really thick, intimate family life, then we're not going to have that caring self to bring out to the public life. And I think we need to remember there's deep connective tissue there.
I sense, I was trying to decide whether to give a positive answer or a negative answer. I'm going to go with the negative one. I sense an attitude when I read the newspapers and watch on TV, et cetera, that's ultimately negative about care because it gets in the way of our autonomous individual crafting our own self. And so there was recently a good article that said, actually, kids can share bedrooms and it's fine. And it's sort of weird that we're establishing a norm that every child needs his own bedroom. I grew up with 3 brothers in my bedroom. At one point, my kids the 2 boys were sharing a bed. It was a bottom bed of a bunk bed, and their sister's bed was like 3 feet away. And so I'm a firm believer in this, but the response to this article was saying, no, this is basically child abuse. This is trying to trick poor women into having more children than they should have. And then there was this idea that was developed decades ago, parentification. Now, parentification, I originally understood to mean an oldest child who doesn't have proper parent figures. So maybe dad's missing, mom's an alcoholic, or mom's working 90 hours a week. So this 12-year-old has to take on these burdens that are inappropriate for their age. Now you see parentification get used to mean the 16-year-old is asked to drop her little brother off at his Little League game when she's driving. That we denigrate this. And so even now, the study that came out today about the benefits of universal childcare, it found the benefits, it just talked about the benefits to the parents. It was, the parents make more money. So, okay, universal childcare allows us to offload this burden so that we can maximize our career success. So I think it's not necessarily mainstream, but it's there, and you see it every day if you're paying attention to it. An idea that care is, it's not good for us because it's getting in the way of us being our full selves as atomized bundles of rights floating around the universe.
Yeah, and I want to just distinguish too between the policy conversation in DC, where I think there's a lot of discussion about the care economy, maybe more discussion than solutions. But I think in the broader culture, there's far more conversation about self-care than neighbor care, right? And I think we just funded a survey from the Making Caring Common project at Harvard, Rick Weisbord and his team. And we asked Americans what they blame for America's loneliness epidemic. And one of the top 3 or 4 answers they gave was too much focus on self-care. We have become inwardly focused rather than outwardly focused. We're more interested in self-care than on neighbor care, and the popular culture just glorifies self-care and denigrates interdependence, denigrates dependence. And so I think if we're asking the question, what do Americans think? I think a lot of Americans who are fed the popular culture think that they need to somehow be more focused on themselves at exactly the moment in our history when they want and are desperately crying for more connection.
Just to add one more thing to that, the giving to others is self-care, right? Like that, for example, in my book, I dig into all the research on caring for elderly, ill or disabled individuals. And for so long, researchers just looked at that data for information on how stressed this group was. And this group was stressed, and they're very stressed. And I don't want to minimize the burdens. And I absolutely believe people that are doing elder care should have more support across the board in this culture. But they were only looking for stress. And when another group of researchers revisited the same data, they found that these people, some of them actually, yes, they were stressed, but actually they were living longer because of care. They actually had a deep sense of meaning because of care. So I think it's we have to hold those contradictions in our hands at the same time and understand, right, self-care, caring for others is self-care, and it is challenging and stressful and hard, but that doesn't mean it's not nourishing us in other ways.
Let's dive a little bit more deeply into how economic and these cultural pressures you've all alluded to really practically affect caregiving in the U.S. today.
I'll talk about economics because I thought Kamala actually gave a really good answer. There's a show, which is apparently this huge YouTube show, Call Her Daddy, that the vice president went on. And she got asked, 1 in 4 young people say they don't want to have kids. What do you have to say to that? And the first answer, because they can't afford it. I think the cultural problems are bigger than the affordability problems, but she went right to where the affordability problem was real, which is the inability to buy a home. It's just so much more expensive. I think the main way in which the cost of raising kids has gone up is the opportunity cost. That is, women have the ability to make much more money, and being a mom takes away from that ability. But other than opportunity costs, it's really not that much more expensive until the last few years when the housing cost goes way up. And one of the key things that's really underappreciated about this, all of you probably remember the families where 3 people lived on the same street as their mom. And your proximity to mom when you were raising your kids, your proximity to dad, to the kid's grandfather, the kid's grandmother is immense. It's beyond words, beyond money almost, how valuable that is. But if buying a house is this insane thing that's basically unaffordable to most people, you can't buy a house on the same street as mom. And so just a couple's likelihood to have a second kid is largely predicted by how much help they got from any of the grandparents with the first kid. And so for me, that's a cultural economic intersection there where the house price isn't the only thing. I think people thinking, growing up means getting away from home. That's a psychological, cultural contributor to it. But also the people who would want to live on the same block as mom find they can't afford it.
Yeah. And I think just building on that, Tim, Wendell Berry pointed this out years ago, right? That if you stay close to family, you're a loser, right? In much of the culture, You have to leave. You have to go to the big city. You have to achieve in finance or consulting or whatever it is. And God forbid you move back home to live on the same street with your parents in a neighborhood of modest-sized homes. And I think, again, that's another area where the culture is sending messages. And I think this is particularly on higher education. They do not, and this is Wendell Berry, they do not prepare, our higher education institutions do not prepare us for the tasks of going home, of being good and productive citizens at home, and frankly, taking care of the places that village made us.
Can I say something real quick? I think for me, as a clinical social worker, culturally, when I look at America, we pay social workers horribly. We pay teachers horribly. We pay anyone that's responsible for caring for another person, secondary to athletes, musicians, right? So we want people to care for each other a little bit more, but we're not paying the people who's responsible for the care, right? So I have to contend with these two challenges of trying to feed my family and caring for you, right? So we have to make it a little bit easier by paying them a little bit more. But also I think there's another conflict here is that there's this expectation for us to be neighbors when we're dealing with our own traumas. We have this saying at Fathers Uplift, I can't parent anyone if I can't parent myself. So while you're always caring for someone, if you're not cognizant of your own trauma, your care would not be care to be damaging. So we have to really look at being able to not only care for others, but also care for ourselves and find that balance. But society has to make that a little bit easier. We got to start paying the care professional a little bit better.
Thank you. There are deep reasons why we don't value caregiving. And I was reminded of anecdotes from your book in hearing them describe what was coming up, of the idea of leaving the home being the ideal, like the hero's journey, going out there, going on your quest, getting away from where you came from. And reading your book and learning and centering much more on the lives of women who so frequently, right, didn't have that opportunity and grew internally because of it. And so much of this conversation around care does center on how we think about the role of women, how we compensate women, and how women have internalized these messages. So what can you say about the woman thing, how that plays into the conversation here?
Yeah. I think a lot of our associations with feminism, right, is about women leaving the home and to find more opportunities for meaning beyond the home, which is real, money and power. And I love those things. I am grateful that women before me fought for my ability to have freedoms and achieve economic independence to the degree that I am today. So I don't want to denigrate that. But I think that there's no question that care is the unfinished business of the women's movement. And we had a family structure that worked. It wasn't perfect. A lot of women were unhappy, or like my grandmas, they were not unhappy caring, but it put them in a deeply economic, insecure place. And it was a structure, and we could function as a family unit in that structure, and we don't have that structure anymore. Many women today are working out of economic necessity or because they have other things they want to do in addition to being a mom, which they also really appreciate. I get all the time the question when I talk about writing this book, positive book about care. They're like, but you work. And I was like, I can do both. I promise. I got a big brain and a big heart, right? So I think that's where we are today. It's the crossroads we're at. And we need to be able to break out of these really simple narratives around care that I think a lot of the feminist movement, which I consider myself part of, are still in, of framing care as a burden or only a problem to be solved and not also an opportunity. I also personally don't think we're actually going to get the kind of infrastructure and policies we need if we stay exclusively in that framing. I think it's really important to broaden the narrative of care, to have care as a hero's journey, to think of it in a sense of true possibility. And, honestly, if my husband does, I wouldn't say we're 50-50 on any given day, but he is a very active caregiver. He is a hands-on parent. And it's not duty. We're not, we don't keep a spreadsheet, honestly, like none of that stuff of like who's doing what when. I can't even imagine adding that to our already hectic life. He does it actually out of love because I've modeled for him that this is like a truly meaningful, powerful experience. And so I think that's part of why for me, I believe in women's emancipation. I believe that we have this unfinished business with care. But if we don't broaden the narrative, and we don't have men doing more care around the home, which is a huge piece of the puzzle, and feeling motivated, we're not going to get there.
Can I talk about that last point about men? I mean, so some of this vocabulary about the care economy, or I was at a Capitol Hill. I think we need to think about how we talk about this. I was at a Capitol Hill briefing. This one woman raised her hand and she said, I would love to get married, but my concern is that men do not play an equal part in the care economy. And what can we do to fix that problem? And my first thought is, you're not looking for a guy to take an equal part in the care economy. You want to find a guy who's going to be a good husband and dad. And let's start with that. And dad, like very specific. We have this tendency in language today to abstract things. Journalists will say like my spouse instead of my wife or my husband. No, the dads are dads. It's a specific thing. And I think about this. I found a picture that my 7-year-old daughter took. She was holding my phone and she got a picture of me playing basketball against my 8-year-old son. And he's taking a jump shot. And I am swatting the heck out of that basketball. Just owning Sean. Like he almost started crying. I stuffed him so hard. I love being a dad. My kids love playing sports with me. My wife, stay-at-home wife, I think that's another thing that's not even close to appreciated enough in this society. But she has no interest in dunking on our children. It just doesn't appeal to her. And as you know, dads know you're a jungle gym. My kids have this game at the pool they call Slippery Tree, where I stand there and they try to climb up onto my head, but I'm all slippery because being a jungle gym is an awesome thing. And that dadness gets denigrated. It gets denigrated so much in this society. Like they used to mock people who were wife guys or who would brag about their sons. Like in the mainstream media, dadness, that needs to be uplifted as its own thing. Because one of the most positive developments we were talking earlier is dads now are, compared to our own fathers and our own grandfathers, stepping up more. And that needs to be applauded. Those role models need to be held up more.
And we can't forget about the dads that's fighting like hell to step up. You know, I think in the African-American community specifically, there's this assumption that if you don't see dad doesn't care about his kids. When in fact, there's a lot of things connected to racism and systemic oppression that makes it difficult for the father to stay engaged. Mass incarceration, right? Outrageous child support payments that make it difficult for them to stay engaged. Issues with the mother, right? So I think just because you don't see me doesn't mean I don't love my child. And I think that's what we have to also tell the story. You know, yes, there's black fathers like me, brown fathers like me that's actively engaged and would die for their kids. But the same is true for dads that you don't see that would also die for their kids, that are trying to overcome those barriers and stay engaged. So I think it's also telling the other side of the story as well.
Let's shift a little bit constructive, a little bit positive. There's so much to talk about. We do not have enough time on this panel. What could we learn from other countries, other cultures, subcultures, even in the US, about how to approach care in a more humane way, including elder care, to start to shift into a healthier way that I think we all want?
I'll jump on this because I for my recent book, I went to Israel. I went to more LDS places, the Latter-day Saint. I went to Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Maryland, right where I used to live, Kemp Mill. And part of what jumped out at me, there was a map published by a think tank once that talked about childcare deserts, where there's not enough childcare. Kemp Mill and the suburbs around Salt Lake City showed up as childcare deserts, because in their mind, the only childcare was institutional paid childcare to enable both parents to work 40-hour-a-week jobs, basically. There are no mothers who feel more supported than the mothers of Kemp Mill and in the suburbs around Utah, because their model for childcare on a lot of the days of the week in Kemp Mill. So there's 2 Orthodox synagogues in Kemp Mill, and they all walk because they don't drive on the Sabbath. So think about how tight-knit this neighborhood is going to be. So their childcare is largely let your kids run around the neighborhood. If they do something bad, somebody else's dad from a front porch, somebody else's mom from the sidewalk is going to yell at them, and you're going to know, mom and dad are going to know right away. That's a model that really is the it takes a village model. And then similarly, living closer to mom. In Israel, 70% of parents get help from their at least one of the sets of grandparents. It's 35% in Europe. And so that, I think, is the main thing we have to think about. And our policymakers just focus on the institutional child care or something like that. I really think we have to say, how do neighbors, if you got a bigger child tax credit, maybe it's spent on child care, or maybe it's spent on building a granny flat so mom can move in above the garage. So that was what I saw in these religious communities here and abroad, was relying on, and also the Amish, I include them, relying on informal childcare. Final note, the Amish, I asked this girl, Elizabeth, the youngest of 5 in Pennsylvania, and I said, so are there a lot of big families here? She said, yes. I said, 5 is not a normal number of kids for a couple to have in the U.S. And she said, yeah, it's just a religious thing. I said, but do you have ways of making it easier for parents? And she said, no, I can't think of anything. I said, you said your older brother is married and has kids. How far away does he live? 10 feet. I said, do you regularly provide childcare? She said, it's nothing formal, but about once a day, he'll say, hey, Elizabeth, can you watch the kids? I got to run out. How much would you pay for that?
Yeah, and Tim, I think this is something that you address in your book as well. I mean, the physical infrastructure of places, right? So the example, the Orthodox Jewish neighborhood is a really good one. My wife and I went for the 3rd month of her maternity leave this year to a little town in Umbria called Spello, and we just lived there for a month with our 2-month-old and our then 3.5-year-old. And I was amazed at how the physical design of an Italian town of about 5,000 people, I guess, is so much more conducive to the sort of community care. I mean, our son was not speaking any Italian, but he was running around in the streets, frankly, with these other Italian kids. And there were, to borrow from Jane Jacobs here, many, many eyes on the streets, in a way that fostered care that was intergenerational, that was multilingual, right? We were not speaking their language, they were not speaking ours, but the physical infrastructure of the place. The problem, of course, is so many of our cities where there are green spaces, where there are pocket parks, where there are all these sort of amenities and innovations that have been developed to make cities more walkable and more bikeable and so forth, are unaffordable to families with even one kid, much less 5 or 6 kids. So I would make a plug for rethinking the city design, the physical infrastructure of our places to be more conducive for caring.
Let's add one more piece to this. So I feel like a lot of times we talk about how we don't have a proper culture of care in America because we're a very individualistic culture and we compare ourselves to other more collectivist cultures abroad. And I think it's worth noting what's happening in a lot of Asia right now, particularly Japan and Korea, where there's been a long-standing, deeply collectivist culture, deep respect for elders, a culture of caring for parents. When I interviewed a Hindu theologian for my book, she was like, we don't have a word for care. It's something that's so embodied. But I think it's important to note that the woman didn't feel respected. The woman didn't feel truly honored and appreciated and supported for their care work, and they're now essentially going on strike. So they started as this collectivist culture, and they're bowing out of care. And absolutely, I'm not ascribing it to one thing or the other. It could be influences of individualism from the West. But I do think we need to remember, because women have historically done a lot of this care work, the eyes have been female eyes, right? For so long, that we need to make sure the women are happy and the women feel supported in their care, the women feel secure in their lives. And again, that's where I think is, if we can nail that, we're really going to get somewhere.
And I have one example too, and thank you all for that. I think it starts, I love stories. When I was a kid, I had this dad in the neighborhood tell me it's Christmas time. He was putting up Christmas lights with his son, and I went over to his house and said, hey, can I join you? He said, no, you're not my responsibility. You can't put up Christmas lights with me. And I always remember that. So I believe we want to do the opposite of that. So great examples for me is organizations or people or regions in the world that are doing the opposite of that. So there's one, he probably doesn't normally share this, but one of my colleagues started this organization called Friendship Bench. You probably heard of this. Essentially in Kenya, what he does is he goes around, he teaches grandmothers like the basis of mental health practice. Then you adopt a bench, right? And they know whoever sits on that bench, there's a grandmother there that's ready to pour love into them and talk to them. First Up Bench in Kenya, check them out though. But it really speaks to this communal way of caring. And essentially suggesting that caring is our responsibility as a whole. It isn't just one person's responsibility. So I think it's a great example that does the opposite of the story I just shared earlier.
Actually, one more quick story based on that. That truly was like a huge moment for me. And this happened before I had kids. I was at my friend Ronit's house. She's Israeli in New York City. And there was a woman there that was so involved with her children, yelling at them, playing with them, feeding them, like fully immersed in a way that I was like, oh, this is Ronit's sister. Like it was to me, I was like, how exciting. Ronit's sister's here from Israel. I'm finally get to meet Donna. I've heard so much about her. And I was like, Ronit, who is that? And she's like, I have no idea. And honestly, it changed. It actually created a lens on what collective care could look like that I carried with me. Got me in trouble sometimes because I would feed kid food maybe their parents didn't approve of or did something wrong. I was like, how much better is it if we can just get on the ground with other people's kids? Maybe we're going to screw up whatever their vision of parenting is, but we get the collective piece as a result.
There was a story a few years back. There were a couple stories that came out about cops being called because parents were supposedly neglectful. One of them was this kid who was locked out of his house on like a 95-degree day. He came home from school. His parents weren't there, and there's no key out for him to be let in. And so he's just like shooting basketball on the street, and then he's finally like sitting in the one shady spot, and he's dripping with sweat. And the next door neighbor decides that he's being neglected, calls the cops who come, and the parents get in trouble. And so obviously this is this horrible story. And then when I was listening to the discussion of this on the local radio station, WTOP, two of the callers said that nosy neighbor should have minded her own business. And I thought, if calling the cops and ignoring the kid are our only two options, this is a hyper-individualism. So the third is bring a Gatorade. Even if you can't, this day and age feel you couldn't invite, because you don't know him, you couldn't invite him into your air-conditioned house, that itself is a poverty that she would feel that way. But she could certainly bring him a Gatorade and a shade tent.
So we've diagnosed the problem. We've already pointed out some examples that are either innovative in the modern world or perhaps drawing from the ancient world. What are you seeing that gives you hope or you think provides a model for how we move forward towards a more human, whole approach to care?
Yeah, I think, well, for me, I just want to chime in real quick. I think that caring must be composed of providing care for the caretaker, right? I think, yeah, it's our responsibility to pour into other people, but we need someone to pour into us. So I think, how do we support models or even bring forward models that not only care for the person, but don't ignore the person providing the care? I think sometimes we get it wrong. We're completely worried about caring.
I agree. And if I could just jump in, I mean, we did have some, I think, worthy critique of self-care in this context. But part of the reason that mothers are craving the space for self-care is because no one's taking care of them, right? I mean, tale as old as time. So what do we practically need to do to pour into them in a way that they don't have to only care for also themselves in addition to everything?
Well, is that true? Because a lot of the mothers I know have friends. I can't say it about a lot of the men I know, right? So my wife has girlfriends. A lot of the mothers, it's very rare have I met a mother who doesn't have friends that can pour into her, right? Or even go to the hairdresser. So yes, some of that is true, but also some of it is not true, right? I think it's important for us to know who those people are. And a lot of us men, right? We have people that can pour into us, but sometimes we're too prideful to call them, right? So I think a part of this is acknowledging who's your care team and using them. And perhaps that's also part of the solution, teaching you how to utilize your care team when you need them and how not to have so much pride to use them. You would go broke or struggle before you call somebody and let them know. That's a part of the American culture. We have to get rid of that, right? We all have our low moments. How do we ask for help when it's needed? And that's why I says, we all have friends. Some of them use us. Some of us use them better than others, but we all have somebody we can call.
I very much envision a world in which families, particularly mothers, are especially well cared for in the first year of their child's life. I think it's barbaric, frankly, that moms and dads have to rely on external childcare within the first 6 weeks of a child's life, right? And so that to me immediately says we need generous paid family leave. Less than 1% of Finland's infants are in licensed external care because they have generous paid leave. And I think it also not only allows moms and dads to take care of their newborn babies, but also allows the space, the flexibility, the time, the financial resources to go to parent groups, go to coffee with another mom, right? All of these things. The second thing I would say is we need to do a much better job supporting stay-at-home parents. Many, many families say that they wish they had the financial resources for a parent to stay home and care for a child, particularly in the youngest years. Shameless plug, we have a report, Senior Fellows Elliot Haskell and Ivana Greco coming out next week on this. And one of the things that's in the range of solutions, but it's very interesting too, that 1/5 of all stay-at-home parents in America are dads. And so we need to do a much better job, broadly speaking, of supporting stay-at-home parents. And Tim, to something you said earlier, what they've identified to us as their most pressing concern is housing costs, right? So if we want to support stay-at-home parents, if we want to empower choices by parents to care for their children in the ways that they think best and align with their values, one of the most important things we can do is address the cost of housing.
But also, I mean, we talk about loneliness and all that stuff. I talked to many stay-at-home parents when working on my book, and I heard the same phrase from a lot of them, especially the stay-at-home moms. The loneliness is the thing. Like, you're never lonely. You're never alone because you can't even go to the bathroom without somebody bothering you. But it's lonely if the only people you can talk to are basically the equivalent of your drunk college roommates all the time, which is what children are. They're just drunk adults. And so right around across the street from my own Catholic parish was this Christian Reformed church that every Tuesday it was just called Mom's Coffee. And it had childcare, and it had like a little kids Bible hour for the kids who were preschool age, and then babysitters basically to watch the other kids. And that was absolutely necessary. And I thought, why doesn't every religious congregation have this? In Montgomery County, Maryland, I beat them up in my book, but they actually have a ton of parent, child, mommy, me, daddy, me story hours at the libraries. And that sort of thing is just immensely, it's again, valuable beyond price. And so this is a place where I think every religious congregation should think, what little thing can we do that would be relatively easy to be the village, and not to be the village, but to foster it, to host it. Let's get dads together with their kids, even their babies. Let's get moms, especially the stay-at-home moms, together during the week so they have somebody normal to talk to, somebody to make them a cup of coffee, that sort of thing. That would be immensely valuable. And it's insane to me that it's a rare thing that religious congregations do that.
That's absolutely true. In our surveys too, the loneliness is the thing. Mommy and me is mommy and me. We need 1/5 of all stay-at-home parents in this country are dads. And if moms feel lonely, dads feel especially lonely because they do not feel like they can show up to those mommy and me groups, for example, as stay-at-home dads.
So it's got to have more basketball where we get
It's got to have more basketball, or it just needs to be for guys.
I'm going to speak on behalf of dads for a second. Dads do definitely do a lot of that rough and tumble play, but I imagine both of you also really do that tender work as well, right? It's not just the rough and tumble. It's the true.
Absolutely.
It's those soft, vulnerable moments when your kid's crying and you're the shoulder and you have to find their way, not out of pain, but through pain with them,
But I never let them win, just so you know.
I'm going to ask them. I'm going to fact check that. Yeah, I want all 5 emails. Yeah.
I mean, eventually they beat me. That's the point.
Now I give them a win.
up until age 5.
It's all right. Yeah, I think, listen, I do believe the policy change piece is a big one of this. I believe we need flexible policies that work for families in different arrangements at different times. There's no one size fits all solution to the care crisis. They also think the narrative change piece is huge. When I started writing my book, I realized that I took, philosophy 101, economics 101, anthropology 101. I studied English literature, read all the great books. Like, care was just missing from all of that. And the only time I really heard about care is in Women's Studies 101, and it was exclusively in the burden framework. And as part of my book, I look at care through all these different lenses in my book. And the last chapter is about care and religion, and spoke with a lot of feminist theologians that are trying to put care at the center of the religious experience. So I want to just piggyback on what you were saying, like in addition to real, what I would call care, supportive caregivers, care infrastructure at our religious institutions. And for a long time, I 100% went to synagogue every Saturday because there was free childcare and lunch. And I could sit with my friend Elise and gossip after services, and my children, I didn't even see them, and I'd have to cook and I have to clean. So I love that. But I'll tell you something else I loved. I love that when I was synagogue hopping after I moved to Oakland, California, I love that my current rabbi, came up and didn't just look at me, looked my son Augie right in the eyes, had as much curiosity about Augie as he had about me. Like, that's a care ethic. Children are never a nuisance. You can't be annoying to our rabbi because you're a child and you're acting like a child. And I think the last thing that's really important for me is that care, not only are you supported as a caregiver, and the reality of dependency is not just acknowledged, but welcome and nurtured in this space. The wisdom I get from care is welcome on the bima. That's what we call kind of the stage at the front of the synagogue, right? I get up there and I give sermons, essentially, we call droshes, that are inspired by my care experiences. So I also get religious authority based on the wisdom I've achieved through care. And that's kind of the next layer I'd like religious institutions to take it to, that we move beyond supporting caregivers and actually see the people who give care, the woman, as someone who deserves religious authority and power and more power in the institutions, because historically that just wasn't the case. Okay, well, I can see that you all care about care. So I have a lot of questions from the audience. I believe you can still send them in and it will refresh. I'm going to shift to bear questions now. Here we go. So we've alluded to this, but from a practical perspective, what is one pro-family or pro-caregiving public policy that should be prioritized in 2025? Paid leave.
Sidewalks, crosswalks, playgrounds, every other block, walkability will give us more happier families.
Here's one. We're encouraged to go to the market to meet the caring needs of the young, the old, the vulnerable. The average hourly pay for a care worker in the U.S. is $18.73. What can we do about this? $18.73.
I mean, it's really tough to fix this because what we have on one hand is parents who can't afford safe, clean, reliable childcare. And the biggest input into that is the wages. And so part of the problem is we have the one little thing I think we could tweak is we regulate the wrong things here. In Washington, D.C., you cannot be a daycare worker if you do not have a college degree. My wife does not have a college degree. My wife is raising 6 kids, has helped raise about 30 nieces and nephews, helped raise 4 younger siblings. It would be illegal for her to start a childcare with a colleague with just looking after 6 kids. So that's a regulation that's not geared towards what parents and children need, and it drives up the cost. That would help it a little bit, but it's a real tough squeeze considering that, these workers are not paid enough, but the cost of it is too much.
You also, I know from your book, advocate for some policies around incentivizing stay-at-home parents. Can you say more about that?
So one thing is that if Social Security, I get this statement and it says you have worked enough hours to earn full benefits. If you stay at home from the moment you get married at age 23 and you were 2 years in the workforce, you might not be eligible for Social Security benefits. And so I think that stay-at-home parenting should count towards that is definitely one of the things that I would.
So to ask a follow-up then, a lot of people don't believe that they should have Social Security. A lot of people on the right. So how would you answer concerns about not, why they should provide it?
I mean, part of the thing is we think in such materialistic economic terms, and we think GDP is the nation's health. Guess what? If right now if my wife is going to make dinner out of ingredients that are in our cupboard, that's lowering our GDP. If I, take leave from work, if I take unpaid leave and look after my kids, that's lowering our GDP. All of that stuff is good. It's good for the country. It's good for the culture. It's good for my family and other people's family. And so part of it is that we do need to convince people to overcome that and say there are greater goods than the ones that get measured by GDP.
Yeah, the measure of our health as a country should in part be the stability and quality of family life in America. I don't know how necessarily to measure that, but I think you're absolutely right that we have to figure out a way to measure that, or at least to move beyond GDP rather than just incorporating care work into GDP, because I feel like that would just sort of continue the materialist approach that you're describing.
Here's an interesting one. The average home has more than doubled in size. I know this is true. My grandma's house raised 4 kids. I would have even considered that house today, right? It now includes standard equipment, air conditioning, multiple bathrooms, a whole array of appliances, Wi-Fi, good Wi-Fi. And that explains in part why it's harder to afford. If you add in restrictive zoning, adds more than 40% to the cost. In view of the last session on Mammon, should simple living be a part of the solution to this crisis in parenting around home affordability?
One thing I've seen people talk about, so when you hear people talk about urbanism, it's often like, I want to be able to walk to my cocktail bar. I think a family-friendly urbanism needs to take center stage. And part of that would be, how can you build relatively affordable houses that are great for families? And part of it is an American thing. I really wanted my own yard, and we all do. And that's not as true in Spain, for instance. There's family-friendly apartment buildings that are built to be for family. Like the parking is such so that you can park and there's a stroller right there. But also we could do that with townhouses here. So that's what I would look at. Just imagine where you might be in a garden apartment, but there's a courtyard in the middle. And when you need to call the kids in, you just open the back window and you shout out there. That does exist, but for some reason, garden apartment living in the U.S. is denigrated as oh, that's for poor Hispanic immigrants or something. But housing that's built to be okay, this is going to be relatively easy to raise kids in, but it's not going to have all the bells and whistles. But you can keep an eye on your kids while you're working from your kitchen. I think that's doable as a way that would be a balance between cost effective and family friendly.
I think there's a psychological piece to this, and I think it's important. You said your grandma's house, right? So it wasn't your parents' house. And I think the way the economy has shaped and shifted over the past 50 years is that many people's grandparents had the smaller house, and then their parents had the bigger house. And it feels a little bit like going back, right? And especially if your parents were immigrants or you come from some, let's say late 19th century, early 20th century immigrants, and there was kind of supposed to be this arc towards growth, and that growth was represented not exclusively, but in the size of your house. So I think it's a mindset change that it will maybe take a generation to happen, I think, on some level. This isn't failure. This isn't retreat somehow, that this is actually maybe a better, more realistic way to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is interesting in light of sort of broader conversations about democracy, because our founding fathers would have thought our obsession with luxury and large home. I mean, of course, Thomas Jefferson, of course, hated luxury, but he lived in an amazingly big house, right? Nice. And enslaved people. But take somebody like John Adams. John Adams would have abhorred our fascination with money and luxury and so forth, and certainly the Transcendentalists and the Puritans, right? They're these, and the progressives in the early 20th century, certainly. So they're been these ebbs and flows throughout our history. And this is kind of where I'm hoping for a great awakening of sorts, right? A return to plain living and high thinking in American culture. It's lacking, but I think it's much broader than just care and has some in housing, and it has a lot more to do with how we relate to one another or fail to relate to one another as citizens equal in dignity.
Okay. A topic we haven't discussed, but is interesting. I'm interested in your thoughts on the impact of social media, adding stress to parenting and childcare, especially for women. It feels like every attempt to balance work and parenthood, to utilize childcare, is criticized sharply and leads to blame and shame. I want to answer that question, but I'm also curious about how digital culture and social media has shaped the speed of this conversation, the tenor of it, and what you think we could do to, your work, retell the story.
I was on a podcast recently, and the podcaster's like, well, you're from the older generation, which I didn't know I was. I was like, she's like, so you probably don't really understand. But the truth is I don't, I had my first kid in 2012. I did kind of miss the Instagram parenting advice boat. And I think I'm Gen X cusp, 1979 born, that I think I would have been too cynical for it all along anyway. But you're right. I'm saying this as someone kind of proudly from this older generation, but I've witnessed it with everyone that's coming after me, that I think social media and I think Instagram parenting advice culture is deeply detrimental to parents. And it's a time, right, we have this, increased isolation, we have loneliness, you're looking for that community. It's really easy to pick up your phone and scroll for 2 minutes and have someone opine about your family life when your family life is made up of one very unique individual, the parent, with another very unique individual, the child. They have no idea what's best for you. So I think it's played into the insecurity piece, and then it's also played into the lack of good faith and skepticism piece more broadly, that I've been, again, has had me shocked as I've been in book promotion worlds of the things people say to me. Like, aren't you just making a case for the trad wives? I was like, no, I'm not at all. I am a working woman who considers herself a feminist. I don't think just because I honor care, but that's how blinded people are now.
I think I'm the momfluencers, as I'll call them in my book, and it's half of them. And trad wife went from being wears a veil at mass and to now being you are literally a supermodel who makes cornflakes from scratch before your kids get up for breakfast. I was like, there's nothing traditional about it. Nobody ever did that. But so scrolling through Instagram is something I know you can do when one hand is out. I could feed a baby with a bottle. I remember I would pick Twitter fights with Matt Iglesias when I had babies, and that's what I would do. And other people would scroll through Instagram. But part of what it's doing, besides it gets into you by filling the boredom because the tech is so easy, but because you need a village to raise a child. My wife's little sisters do not turn to Instagram for guidance because they've seen all their sisters raise children. They have a bunch of neighbors who are doing it. And they're like, that was a real helpful hint you came up with. It's not the crazy helpful hint, the Pinterest or Instagram insane, helpful hints that nobody could ever do. It was, this is what you did, what you pulled up. This is the thing you stopped worrying about. This was a baby thing you didn't buy. You didn't need the wiper warmer, for instance. But you don't need to turn to Insta for that if you're surrounded by other dads, other moms who are engaged in the same thing. Guess what? Whenever I talk to a 20-something-year-old now who has kids, they always tell me I am the only one in my social circles who's married with children. They don't have that.
I think the lack of multi-generational communities is such a big piece of this too. How often maybe this is not common in your circles, but I know many parents for whom they did not change a diaper until they had a baby of their own. That was the first time they're the Velcro, what's the sticky part, which, and that's a problem. And that's not necessarily an individual problem. It's a problem that's rooted deep in our culture now, how siloed we are from each other. And, the decline of faith communities, which Jess Gross and Michael were talking about earlier, is a big part of that because, far and away, the majority of our intergenerational meetings happen in our synagogue.
Okay, we have time for one more question from the audience, and I'm going to ask it of each panelist because I think it will help close us out today. And here it is. How has America's hyper-individualized concept of success harmed our idea of community, and how do we work to repair that harm? Charles, can I start with you?
Wow. I think for me, when I think about, the people that we highlight in society as role models, right? I think often we do a lot of hyper focus on athletes. Did the Ravens win yesterday, right? Who's winning the Super Bowl? These individuals that are making millions of dollars, but we forget about the grandmother who hugs you every time you walk in her house and who cooks you a home-cooked meal. I think those are role models we need to tell the world about. And I think once we have a healthy balance of introducing the world to those role models, like your uncle who took you to basketball games when your father couldn't, right? Or the mother who told you that you're tall, dark, and handsome, that you could do anything you want if you put your mind to it, in the absence of your own mother, right? We need to tell the world those stories, and I think we do a horrible job at telling those stories. We do a great job at telling the stories about athletes and politicians and what Trump says tomorrow, right? I think we have to have a healthy balance, and that contributes to the change. It exposes us to role models that it don't cost $1 million to be. You could be like my grandmother, Maddie Mae Marshall, for free. You could cook them, though. You could hug somebody. You could tell them that you love them, right? But it costs to be like athletes. So that's kind of my thing.
I'm a big believer in emphasizing storytelling because I get paid to do that. So I like that. But I do think on an institutional level is where the recovery is going to have to be. And the most important institution of civil society in American history has been the church. And that what it's going to take, I think, is a great awakening, is people returning to church. I don't know how that's going to happen. It's happened before. Maybe it's miraculous. But that, I think, would be the thing. Church, synagogue, mosque, people going back there every week. That's what's going to pull us away from our hyper-individualist mindset and make us start thinking communally and about caregiving again.
Yeah, and that's all great. I would just add an insight that my colleague Ian Marcus Corbin has shared with me after teaching ethics to business schools at a few universities in Boston. People have a notion of success, and they cling to that notion of success in part because they're afraid of what Ian calls social death. That if I go to this business school and don't get a job at McKinsey in London, but go home and run my dad's business in South Carolina, I am a failure. And so I would make a plea for another important institution of civil society in American history, the university, many of which, of course, were supported by churches. And I think many of those church-supported institutions have embraced the culture's definition of success. And so I think that is also a place and an opportunity for a great awakening.
So Glamour magazine, they named, I think it's their Woman of the Year. I'm not 100% sure, but that's it. Okay, so on the cover of the magazine, they write the mothers. And I was like, But then I see it's the mothers of, perhaps it's Billie Eilish, the most famous high-achieving, the startup lady. Yes. So at first I was like, yay. And then I was like, ooh, because they're praising, the mothers of people who are super famous and rich and successful and probably have a crazy work lives and never see their families. I don't know that, and so I was like, this is so wrong. These are not the mothers I want praised. Yay to those moms. I don't want them not praised. But if this is the mothers that get the attention, we're not actually moving past the culture that makes every other mother feel small or invisible. I'll end with my favorite thing to say to moms. It's not going to cure society, but maybe if I'll do it. Or any person doing that quiet, intimate care that is that brings you dark souls of the night, that's as rich and challenging as anything else, but that happens behind closed doors in your house. I tell them to play Hollywood sports movie music in their head while they're doing it, like the George Clooney Boys on the Boat soundtrack. And it's if you can at least tell yourself it's the hero's journey, even put it on your Spotify too, and at least we can start really internalizing it for ourselves and then internalizing in our connections with others. And I hope that from there, we can internalize as a society that every single caregiver is worth their own George Clooney movie, in my opinion. Please join me in thanking our panelists today.
You've been listening to the For the Good of the Public podcast, an initiative of the Center for Christianity and Public Life. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast so you don't miss an episode. CCPL is a donor-supported nonprofit. Visit our website at ccpubliclife.org to learn how you can partner with us, and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Our hosts for today's episode are CCPL founder and CEO Michael Ware, and myself, Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor Phoebe Meyer. Our podcast is produced by Glowfire Creative and Liminal Podcasts. Our in-studio recording engineer is Conrad Ossie Poets. Our podcast editor is Seth Creekmore, and our theme music is Lamb's Farm by Sam Barsh.